Good afternoon. My name is Paula Boland, and I am the president of the UN Association of the National Capital Area, one of the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the USA, serving over 1,200 members in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Our mission is to educate about the vital work of the UN and its agencies around the world, and to advocate for a strong US-UN partnership. And we do this through our educational programming and advocacy outreach at the global and local levels. So if you're not yet a member, please join us at UNA-NCA.org. Of particular interest is a new exciting membership category with benefits for our young professionals, including more opportunities for leadership and professional development. Today's program is brought to you by our young professionals, ably led by Alanis William, Najad, and many others who are making this a wonderful opportunity to learn about timely topics and to engage with other young professionals in the area. And we're delighted to partner once again with the young professionals in foreign policy. Today's discussion will examine the impact on migrants and refugees of the Russian war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year has created the largest humanitarian crisis Europe has seen in decades, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the escalating conflict. Neighboring countries and international organizations are mobilizing to condemn Russia's war and provide relief for the growing number of refugees. The crisis has displaced 6.6 million people inside the country. Over 6.3 million people from Ukraine have crossed into neighboring countries in the region, including Poland, Hungary, Moldova, and others. As the crisis continues to develop, humanitarian needs are multiplying and spreading by the hour. Of the 18 million people in Ukraine who will be impacted by the ongoing war, 12 million are expected to need humanitarian assistance. Prior to this recent crisis, nearly 3 million people already were in need of humanitarian aid across Ukraine, including over 850,000 internally displaced people. Particularly vulnerable groups, including older people, which comprise 30% of Ukrainian refugees in need, and people with disabilities who might be unable to flee from high-risk areas. Women and children, who make up 90% of people fleeing the crisis, are at risk of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse, as we will learn during today's conversation. Many agencies, including UNHCR, among others, are on the ground ensuring basic and urgent needs are met and scaling up protection services, such as psychological support, counseling, and identification of particularly vulnerable groups, like unaccompanied minors. It is now my pleasure to introduce Amanda Molina from our young professionals, who will be introducing our speakers and moderating the conversation. She's a DC-based attorney specializing in data privacy, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence at Microsoft Corporation. In addition to her full-time career, she serves as a captain for the Judge Advocate General in the United States Air Force Reserve Corps. Prior to joining Microsoft, she served for 3 years in the Office of the Legislative Counsel at the United States House of Representatives, where her portfolio covered a wide range of legal and policy topics. Throughout law school, Amanda worked for multiple government and international organizations, including the White House, Department of State, USAID, and the United Nations. And in her role at Microsoft, she remains a strong advocate and active volunteer for public interest issues. Thank you so much for joining us. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paula, and thank you for everyone joining us today. I have the pleasure of being able to introduce both Gayatri Patel and Oksana Horbunova. Gayatri Patel is the current Vice President of External Relations at the Women's Refugee Commission, and she's also the Vice Chair of Advocacy. In her role, she has over 20 years of experience in women's rights and gender equality, and she currently oversees the organization's policy advocacy with the US government and the United Nations. She previously served as the Director of Gender Advocacy at CARE USA, leading US government advocacy in feminist foreign policy, women's economic empowerment, gender-based violence, and gender and humanitarian emergencies. Gayatri also advised the US State Department on a variety of human rights and humanitarian issues and served as Director of Legal Programming at the Africa Middle East Refugee Assistance Organization, which provides pro bono legal services to refugees and asylum seekers in Egypt. She also holds a law degree from American University. I'm a little biased because I also went to American, with a focus on international human rights and humanitarian law, and a master's degree from the School of International Service and a bachelor's from Mount Holyoke College. Oksana Horbunova is a Ukrainian human rights activist. She's been working on countering trafficking for more than 25 years, starting from the creation of the first counter-trafficking NGO in Ukraine to protect the rights of trafficking survivors. She testified before the US Congress in support of passage of the United States groundbreaking anti-trafficking legislation, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. When pro-democracy protests broke out in Kiev in 2004 and 2013, she was on the front lines to demonstrate for human rights and justice. And she has been serving at the International Organization for Migration Mission in Ukraine at the Counter-Trafficking Program Coordinator for many years. Her counter-trafficking efforts were awarded by the Ukrainian government and honored by Vital Voices Global Partnership for dedication of professional life to combat trafficking in human beings. And since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22, she's been working hard to support Ukrainians, women's NGO, which are providing humanitarian assistance to women with children and other vulnerable groups of internationally displaced persons. So we have a great, panelists today. Before I begin asking them some questions and directing the questions at them, there will be time at the end for anyone to ask a question, but I ask that you all please remain on mute and respect our speakers. And also, you can go ahead and put your question in the chat and we'll get to it at the end, or at least try to get to it at the end depending on time. So my first question is for Oksana. It's been 6 months since Russia's war in Ukraine, which sparked a humanitarian crisis. What is the state of things in Ukraine? You're on mute, Oksana. Oksana, could you take yourself off mute? Sorry, there you go.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this special event. It is very pleasant to see your faces and your smiles, because in my city where I am right now living in city Kyiv, it is very rare to see smiles on the faces of the people. The capital of Ukraine yesterday was heavily attacked by Russian air helicopters, and they were bombing the downtown of the city. And actually it was very unexpected, because front line already moved to the south, and Ukrainian army is doing great success right now to liberate Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian villages. And yesterday day was so difficult. The city was staying without electricity. The people spent whole day underground on the metro station in bomb shelters. The women were forced to give a birth for the baby, not in the hospital, but in a metro station, in bomb shelters. And actually it is very, very difficult to observe, like people were killed in downtown when they were going to their offices to work. And war, unfortunately, is continuing, and situation is very unpredictable. First of all, I have to tell you that so many cities destroyed, like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Zaporizhia right now under attacks. And Paula already mentioned how many people were forced to leave their apartments, to leave their homes. And actually today they do not have the places to be returned because their homes are destroyed. And I just want to underline that most vulnerable part of migrants, it is women with children, it is elderly people. And you know, now the education started, but children are not able to be enrolled into education process because school destroyed. And actually it is dangerous to be in the schools because they could be under attacks, under the bombs any moment. And actually teachers try to organize the education process remotely. It means that children have to stay at home with mothers. But about 7 million of people right now moved from east part of Ukraine to the west part of Ukraine, where they staying in the shelters or in special centers for refugee. And actually NGOs, women rights organizations, human rights organizations try to support these internally displaced people and to support the children, provide them basic needs and to support with accommodation. And it is difficult to predict how long the situation will continue. It depends from situation on the front line. And we are standing right now at the beginning of the winter season, and the issue of heating.
I believe she may be frozen. We'll give her a second.
It is just briefly information about situation in Ukraine, and I'm ready to answer to any additional questions.
Yep, we'll ask additional questions at the end from the audience. But before I get to the next question, I did want to mention to everyone that this meeting will be recorded and they'll provide a recording at the very end. So Gayatri, this question's for you. What has the Women's Refugee Committee's role been throughout the crisis and how has it evolved?
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to the group for organizing this session and to Oksana for your very, very powerful description of what's going on. It's incredible what you're dealing with, and I just want to take a moment to really recognize that this is a time of incredible uncertainty, incredible insecurity for you and your colleagues, and we really appreciate that you're able to be here and speak to what's happening. So yes, I work for the Women's Refugee Commission, and we are a research and advocacy organization that's primarily based in the United States, but we work in countries and crises around the world. And we have two primary roles in any crisis, but in this one, we have focused on advocacy from the very beginning of the conflict to really advocate for attention to marginalized groups, many of whom Oksana mentioned: women, adolescent girls, persons with disabilities, the LGBTQ community that has been very much persecuted in the region, the Roma community who also faces barriers. These groups are often the most underserved during humanitarian crises, despite the risks that they often face. So our advocacy has focused a little bit on that. And really, from the very early stages of the conflict, we've been working very hard with members of Congress, with the US administration, to flag particular protection concerns facing women, girls, and others in these marginalized groups, to urge for immediate action as the humanitarian response is being rolled out. We've urged them to focus on gender-based violence, which we knew was going to be a critical threat from the very beginning. We urge them to focus on gaps in access to sexual and reproductive health services, which is often not prioritized enough in humanitarian crises. We've urged them also to respond to the needs of people with disabilities and elderly people, because they're often the ones who are not able to escape who the shelters are not accessible to them, et cetera. And we've urged them to improve and prioritize protection mechanisms, measures to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, measures to mitigate gender-based violence, and also, very importantly, to focus very hard on the needs of unaccompanied minors and children in general, because they are quite, as Oksana mentioned, vulnerable to human trafficking and other abuses. And then our second role as a research organization has really been to apply some of our best practices that have come up through our research and programs. So focusing a lot on integration of cash-based programming, particularly cash and voucher assistance for protection against gender-based violence and gaps in basic needs. Meeting the full range of medical needs of women and girls in particular, including reproductive health, and advocating for humanitarian implementers to do so as well. And then really focusing on access and challenges and barriers facing persons with disabilities and elderly folks who are some of whom were able to cross into neighboring countries, but many of whom were trapped in their homes in Ukraine without adequate access, without adequate services, and really facing a great deal of vulnerability.
Well, yeah, there seems to be a lot going on in this space, and it's really important for us as young professionals, as people involved are interested in this space, to really understand and grasp of it. So my next question can go to either one of you. What has the international response been like to the rising number of Ukrainian refugees fleeing the crisis? And has there been a difference between the international community and regional responses? Can either of you attest to those things or speak on either?
Oksana, would you like to go first?
Yeah, okay, let's say talk first. Actually, I know about a lot of efforts which were done by international community and international experts to help in the situation what happened in Ukraine. From the first days of the war, I know UN agencies, they try to establish special units on the border crossing area just to let people know about possibility to receive help in a different country, because people were fleeing from Ukraine to West European country and they were absolutely unprotected, because most of them, they are without foreign language skills. They, some of them, they without experience to travel, and some of them, they were without the documents. But they were, most of them, they were represented by women with children, with elderly people, and with animals, because people were leaving their homes and they took with them cats, dogs, all what they have at home. And it was necessary to act immediately just to advise people which directions better to go and how to regulate this migrant routine. And actually, Ukraine very appreciated to the neighboring country, like Poland, like Czech Republic, like Germany, and another country who provided basic needs for the migrants who were crossing the borders. International communities were reacting like trying to establish local units to help most vulnerable people who are not able to leave Ukraine and who are staying in Ukraine. It is like family with many children, like elderly people. And international communities, they use the practice to work in partnership with local NGOs. And actually, I was working on counter-trafficking area, and I would like to share experience that counter-trafficking coalition during the first weeks of the war, refocused their activity from, actually not refocused, but added into their agenda humanitarian issue, and together with local government organized shelters with basic needs for the people who ended up in their area. But so many people were arriving, and it was necessary to work without any kind of holidays, just to support people, just to provide medical support and so on. And actually, Ukrainian NGOs very appreciated to international NGOs, to Vital Voices, and I'm part of the Vital Voices network, who provided immediately possibility to support and to provide basic needs for the people who left their homes. And without this unity, I mean international organization, local NGOs, local government, it was not possible to organize this kind of support. It was special time of unity, and actually Ukraine is appreciated, and Ukrainian society just demonstrated special readiness and special willingness to help these most vulnerable people. Unfortunately, human rights activists, women rights activists, and international experts, we do not have access to the territory which is occupied. And we know that people who still continue to live under occupation, they are limited in medical care, they are suffering from lack of the food, and they are suffering from the human rights violation. It is just briefly.
I really, I just want to add to Oksana's points about the local responses. It was inspiring. It was moving to see so many local women's rights organizations activating from the very beginning of the crisis to make sure that vulnerable people were served. And I think that very much lends to the push within the humanitarian sector towards localized responses. So part of what the Women's Refugee Commission and others have been pushing for with the U.S. government and other donors is really to advance those kinds of efforts, to provide that kind of flexible funding, the ongoing funding that goes into the next fiscal year, even though there's this rush right now to push out funding that's available immediately, to really bring those local organizations into the mix when it comes to humanitarian program design or humanitarian decision making, because they are the ones who are on the ground. They are the ones who have an understanding of the cultural dynamics and the language skills that are needed to make humanitarian aid really effective and really to meet the needs of the people on the ground. And so that part of the response has been really something that we can focus on it and visualize taking into other crises down the line. But there's, in terms of other aid that's being provided, there's a lot of emphasis on child protection. There's a lot of emphasis on meeting basic needs, on winterizing some of the humanitarian aid so that it's accessible even as the weather turns colder. But it's still a struggle sometimes to get the needs of women, girls, others really to be prioritized in a way by the humanitarian implementers who are on the ground. And so continuing to push that to support the local organizations who are on the ground and focus our advocacy on the groups that are really vulnerable is important.
Absolutely. So shifting a little bit now to kind of an economic perspective, what would you, or either of you, this question is open to either of you, what would either of you say is the economic impacts of the migration, and how do you see it playing out in Ukraine in the long term?
Okay, let's say start. Unfortunately, Ukraine is losing right now lots of experts, lots of people with special skills. And I know lots of highly educated people among Ukrainian migrants who are right now in another country. For example, my dentist right now is in Germany. Another doctors in Poland. My favorite designer right now is working in Norway. And these people, they are actually already integrated into local community. They're employed and they enjoy their new position, and local community enjoy to have this kind of expert. But in the same time, Ukraine is losing these people. And we do not know how soon we will be able to return these experts back to Ukraine. Everything will depend from this situation on the fronts, how long the war will continue. And another issue, many people, they are not able to return home because the homes are destroyed, because there is not schools for the children, there is no hospitals for the people. And lots of families, and most it is women with the children, they're staying outside of Ukraine. I know many children, they are enrolled into education process into another country. In the same time, they trying to maintain education according to Ukrainian education system. It means that intention to be returned home is very high, and people willing to be returned home. But we do not know how quick we could stop the war. And it is the issue number one, to stop military invasion, to liberate Ukrainian land. And right now, Ukrainian society is focusing to help Ukrainian army, to support them. In the same time, we have to think how we could help Ukrainian vulnerable refugees and migrants who are in special needs. This is the issue, and the issue how we could overcome the winter, and how we could support each other during the cold winter time. But issue of migration is a special issue, and of course we're interested to monitor it and to have and try to analyze what we could expect tomorrow.
The only thing I would add to that is that there's loss of livelihoods, there's loss of property, of homes. The disruptions in education will have long-term economic impacts for Ukrainian children. I think the other aspect of this is just the impact of this conflict on the global economy, particularly the food crisis and food insecurity that's resulting. That is not only affecting the region, but affecting parts of Africa that are already struggling with food insecurity and elsewhere. And so it's all of these economic, agriculture issues, livelihood issues are all kind of converging at the same time to make it really difficult for those who have fled Ukraine or who are still displaced within Ukraine, but also those outside of that immediate area within the region and globally. So I think that's an important factor for policymakers to keep in mind, and certainly something that humanitarian organizations are feeling the impacts of even outside of that immediate region.
Absolutely, and the whole world is paying attention to what's going on right now, and I'm sure we do have a few other questions later on how we can help, but for now, one of the questions I have is for either of you again is, What are some of the unlikely players that have emerged during the Ukrainian crisis as advocates for those experiencing displacement?
I'm not sure if Oksana was going to jump in, but I would just reiterate our point earlier about local women's rights organizations. These are organizations that really stepped up in the crisis. Also, refugee organizations who had organically formed or others, as well as youth-based organizations who were really driving some of the humanitarian response. But the partnership in some of the countries in the region to where people were fleeing was so critically important. The church groups, the voluntary organizations in Poland, Moldova, et cetera, really have played a role in providing that immediate service and support. But Oksana, I would defer to you.
Yeah, I just see the important role actually of women's organizations, because there's who are working locally, who are working regionally, actually in the country of destination as well as in Ukraine. And these women's NGOs, they were first to respond for the migrant needs, just organizing the shelters, organizing some spaces for children, just involving medical doctors to help the refugees. Absolutely, as well as the in country of destination, and it is good coordination between Ukrainian NGOs and NGOs in the country of destination. I know very good example when it was necessary just to help Ukrainian people who were leaving Ukraine, and it was necessary to coordinate their traveling. It was excellent partnership between Ukrainian and Polish NGO, between Ukrainian women rights NGOs, German, Portuguese, Spain. It was actually international partnership, which was established very quickly just to support people in need.
Absolutely. So looking ahead at the Ukrainian refugees who have been spread out in the US and abroad, what would you say is either of you is the biggest or largest issue that they face? And we've already talked a little bit about some of the most common issues, this practical, like getting your animal out, maybe families not being separated, and then the issues that marginalized communities tend to be affected by a little bit more than the majority. So in your experience and what you've both seen, what might be some of the major challenges that they would face?
Let's say start actually, and you already mentioned the issue of separation of the families. It is very painful issues for Ukrainian families, because according Ukrainian law, men are not allowed to leave country, and the most family are separated because mothers with children, they are leaving the country and they are staying outside of Ukraine, as well as men, they are staying in Ukraine at homes. And this separation is absolutely very, very painful. And it is so difficult for mothers who find out themselves alone with the children to find a new place to live, new place, new employment, and to organize education process for the children. This is the most common issues, plus the issue of language, because most of Ukrainians, they have to start to learn the local language to communicate with local people. And it is huge psychological pressure for mothers, for children. Sometimes family manage to live with grandparents, and it is grandparents are able to help in some way in this situation. But in many families, grandparents, they themselves need help. And actually, this is the biggest problem for Ukrainians. Absolutely, families, they received some social support, but this support is very limited, and mothers with children, they have to find the employment. And of course, there are several obstacles because they are not integrated into local life. They have to take care about the children. They have to learn foreign language, and so on. And I know the intention among Ukrainian refugees. Most of them, they are willing to be back as soon as possible. This process already was started during the July and August. Right now, this process a little bit slowed down because of new attacks of Russians. But anyway, Ukraine is, and Ukrainian organization is ready to support the families who are coming back and who are not able to return to their homes. We have to organize the new places for them. And the Ukrainian government, with international support, tried to build a new residential area. And we try to do it as soon as possible because winter is coming, but we are not so successful in this regard because of limited finance and continuation of Russian attacks.
What I would add to that is, all of those challenges that Oksana mentioned come with deep psychological trauma. And I think that's going to be one of the ongoing challenges that we will be working with for a while in terms of the humanitarian response. Really, for the children who are dealing with family separation, for the mothers who are, struggling to meet the basic needs of their families. That comes with the psychosocial issues and trauma that we need to address. There's also the ongoing risk of gender-based violence. And I think a lot of the vulnerabilities and challenges that Oksana mentioned and that we mentioned before come with follow-on vulnerabilities for exploitation and abuse, for domestic violence within temporary shelters, lack of services and support when you have faced sexual assault or domestic violence, et cetera. So those are all part of the mix that humanitarian responders should be focused on, that I think will have long-term impacts as well.
Yeah, Gayatri, it's there's a little bit further along. I had a question on this, so I'll just go ahead and ask you now. So you spoke about gender-based violence, sexual assault can also be included in that. So how would you say, especially certain soldiers committing these atrocities, how can Ukrainian officials navigate the prosecution of these crimes?
The issue is really very, very difficult, and actually in Ukrainian law enforcement system was established special units to investigate this crime. I know these units are working in police, on police level, as well in General Prosecutor Office. In General Prosecutor Office was established special department with special prosecutor teams to identify, to document, and to investigate this crime. And actually, it is very sensitive crime, and survivors are not ready to report this crime. It is necessary to establish the breach of trust with survivors. And again, very important role are playing in this approach women rights organization, human rights organization. And one of these organizations, like Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties, just a couple of days ago, this NGO was awarded by Nobel Prize award. They have special teams who are traveling to the distance, to the different districts to identify the crime, to talk with survivors. And another organization, they established special hotlines to provide people to report about this crime. But it will take lots of efforts. It will take a time. But actually, Ukrainian society is ready to identify, to investigate, and to support these actions, and also to support the survivors. We have to support people who survive, and we have to work together. Human rights organization, Ukrainian law enforcement officers, and also we have to work very hard to collect the evidence and to punish the criminals. And actually, we are interested to establish special European tribunal to punish these criminals on international level. Absolutely.
I think the other thing to remember is that it's there is this the special work that's happening to support survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence. But there's also sexual violence, other forms of gender-based violence that are happening every day. I mean, some of the temporary shelters have very crowded environments where you don't have the natural protections that would protect young girls or unaccompanied girls or young women from sexual assault or abuse. You don't have the natural social protection networks that would prevent domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And so these are other forms of gender-based violence that really do need to be brought into the mix when it comes to GBV mitigation in humanitarian response, support for survivors, either through the national networks and national responses or through international responses. These are all issues that are often kind of secondary or tertiary when it comes to humanitarian programming that really we advocate to be prioritized, because they can be mitigated, they can be supported, the survivors can be supported, but it has to be built in and it has to be prioritized.
Thank you. A question that's been on my mind, and I'm sure it's on the mind of many of our listeners today, is what can we do? This situation, this humanitarian crisis has gotten so big, and you watch it and you just want to do something, but sometimes it's just hard to understand where to start and what would be the best place. So how do we support? How do we get involved? How do we keep up to date with the ongoing crisis to know what's the latest information?
I mean, I can start off by saying it's really important to. Oh, we lost Oksana. I hope she's able to.
She came back on.
Okay, good. Really important to support the local organizations, local women's rights organizations that Oksana was mentioning, who are on the ground. Direct support through funding, but also through advocacy. I mean, a lot of the advocacy that my organization does is to bring U.S. government resources to support their efforts, galvanize other donors, galvanize the UN community to support the local responses and the work that's happening through women's rights organizations. So it's really important to provide them the support and funding that they need, but also to continue advocating for the marginalized groups who are really vulnerable in this crisis. So I work regularly with Congress and the administration to highlight those issues, make sure they're integrated into humanitarian legislation or funding responses, so that it's elevated in priority. But it's really important for concerned citizens to also make those asks and push for that, or demand for that prioritization.
Oksana, I know you got cut off a little bit. Would you like me to repeat the question, or did you hear it earlier? You're on mute. right?
Unfortunately, I didn't pick up the question because I was disconnected.
Yeah, no problem. So I just asked, what is the best way to get involved to support? A lot of our listeners today are really interested in supporting the refugees and being involved and trying to galvanize others to stay up to date with what's going on. So my question was, how can we get involved?
Uh, I see the different ways, and I'm absolutely happy to know that people is interested to involve and to support. And for Ukraine, it is very important to feel this international solidarity. And actually, what we could do, we could support Ukrainian human rights organization. We could support Ukrainian human rights activists. And actually, what is important, to continue to hold rallies to support Ukraine, to write about Ukrainian the situation in Ukraine, to keep the issue into high-level agenda, just to support the government efforts, which is trying to supply heavy, even heavy weapons to Ukraine, because we depend from the situation on our front line. Also, what is important, it is right now we are facing lots of Russian propaganda, and it's necessary to identify this propaganda and to stop it and to understand what is this. But of course, the most important, to support Ukrainian humanitarian organization, Ukrainian human rights organization, Ukrainian activists, and who are supporting the shelters for refugees, who are providing basic needs, who are supporting the children, trying to help them with education. It is just briefly.
Absolutely. And just to summarize what you both are saying, it seems like we all, especially UNA-NCA, we have unique set of skills, people from all different array and backgrounds. And, you know, people think it's about just, you know, speaking up, which is very important, and advocating to our congressional leaders at the federal and state level, as well as volunteering or assisting these, you know, the NGOs and at the international community. But we also have all these other skills that we can provide, whether from marketing, you know, being able to even do social media assistance, legal assistance. So just wanted to reiterate what I'm hearing here. So I want to go ahead and give the audience answer some of the questions that they have for you. One of the questions I received, and give them time. One of the questions I received was, when we were speaking about the different refugees and the impact or challenges that they faced, have you all seen a difference or are aware of any difference in how Roma people, or especially women and children who are stateless, and how they're treated as refugees coming from that region and in this whole humanitarian crisis?
Just really.
Actually, yeah, this is a question from the audience. Yeah, this is a question from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in and just say, you know, early in the conflict, we were certainly concerned that certain groups who naturally face discrimination or challenges within the community would continue to face those barriers in humanitarian response. I think, you know, it's unconfirmed. We really can't see the numbers as clearly as we would hope, because some of the data is not quite available. But concerns around discrimination, access to shelter, or to livelihoods programs, or to even, you know, some of the reports we were getting about people being turned away at international borders from getting into other countries in the region. And so those are concerns that we were highlighting with members of Congress and others to really focus on. But it's a deeply sensitive issue. It's a deeply political issue in a lot of ways. And so there's no perfect response. And it's just a matter of continuing to make sure that those who are implementing programs and dealing with some of the political dynamics that that programming involves are aware of some of those sensitivities. And so we do recommend that there are gender advisors or other advisors who can specialize in highlighting some of those intersecting factors that might impact access to aid on the ground.
Absolutely. And since I don't see any additional questions, I had another one as well. So we talked about, getting support, reaching out to Congress at the state and local level. It seems that this war has gone on a lot longer than originally anticipated. How can we continue to keep that emergency kind of mentality and keep people aware when people have started to become desensitized to the constant information that we're being provided? But to keep wanting to get involved and understand that this is still a very dire situation.
I think the global impacts of this crisis are long lasting. I mean, the food insecurity that I mentioned before, the impact on our own gas prices and economic issues, those are things that will keep this conflict relevant to people here in the U.S. and out, separated from those who are impacted by the conflict directly. But I think, keeping the focus on humanitarian issues and some of the specific challenges facing those who are refugees or displaced, it's hard. And I think that we face this challenge with any humanitarian crisis, especially now when the world is facing one of the worst humanitarian crises across the board ever. So there is going to be that fatigue. So, continuing to remind those around us that this has global implications on us, on our communities, as well as the people who are directly affected in the area itself.
Oksana, did you want to add to that at all about keeping a sense of emergency?
I think it is important to give a possibility to Ukrainians to speak, to provide, to keep a contact with Ukrainians, non-government organization, with human rights organization, and to keep the issue into an agenda, in the global agenda.
Absolutely. Some questions from the audience here. Recently, the Ukrainian foreign minister canceled his trip to Africa because of the effects in Ukraine. What would the minister need to get in terms of support to ensure that that doesn't occur again, or that he can continue to engage in his diplomatic duties?
Actually, I have to. I'm not ready to answer to this specific issue. I need additional consultation from Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs to answer this question. I'm very sorry.
Sorry, that's fair. Thank you. So one of the other questions is, when it comes to investigating and prosecuting crimes, what efforts can be implemented to ensure trust in officials who are conducting the investigations is that they're held accountable, essentially? How can we ensure that a sense of accountability?
Of investigators?
Of the investigators, yes.
Yeah. And we're talking about gender-based violence, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, and absolutely, the law enforcement officers and investigators, they need special skills to investigate these kind of crimes. And actually, because of that, it is important to work with human rights organizations. And actually, I used to work together with Ukrainian law enforcement system to investigate trafficking-related crime. And I know how it is important to keep best international standards to investigate the crime related to sexual violence. There are several international conventions and requirements which we absolutely have to keep in our minds and to follow to this recommendation, including the mechanisms how to interview the survivors, how to maintain the contacts with the survivors. And of course, it's necessary to think how to support survivors. Actually, there is a problem because Ukraine had a lot of special shelters for victims, for survivors of gender-based violence, but unfortunately, lots of these centers are destroyed right now. And a lot of social workers who used to work together with investigators right now are not able to continue their work. But it is the best way to investigate this kind of crime. It is cooperation of law enforcement with psychologists, with human rights activists, and also to include into investigation the issue of survivor support.
I don't know if you want to add anything, Gayatri. We're going to go ahead and get to closing remarks right after this.
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, it's really also important to provide or to push for accountability for prevention of gender-based violence. I mean, as I was saying before, there are ways to prevent it. There are ways to mitigate GBV in, how we design our support services, how we design our shelters, our food distribution, et cetera. And so holding the implementers accountable for building that mitigation and that prevention into their work is very important. And that looks different. It's not a criminal justice angle. It's really about including women and girls and vulnerable populations in the design of programs, including those local women's rights organizations, the human rights actors who are on the ground to be part of those conversations and decision making.
Absolutely. So thank you both. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but we really appreciate you both taking the time to speak with us and taking the time to explain everything. I know I definitely have been enlightened today and appreciate all the efforts. Najat, I'll let you and the other event organizers take control now. And
yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Amanda, for moderating that. You did a great job. And of course, thank you, Oksana and Gayatri, for sharing your perspective on this issue. I mean, the war started back in February, right? And so there's a lot to be said that much of the issues we discussed today could all be simply stopped with stopping the war in itself. However, that doesn't mean that, discussions like this can't further mitigate some of the issues that we're seeing, right? When it comes to being an advocate, when it comes to keeping the public aware of what's going on, these types of events are important in order to keep that fire, stoke that fire in people, to not forget about the Ukrainian people, to not forget about the issues that are ongoing. With that being said, as part of YP, we do want to continue these kind of dialogues. We do want to keep people appraised of what's going on in the world. And so I encourage you all to come to our next events. One of them is the Careers in Climate Policy on November 17th. And then we also have another event for the U.S. Youth Observer to the UN on October 24th. So just putting that out there as well. Again, thank you to the speakers. And at this moment, I will pass it on to Jessie, who also has some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Najat. My name's Jessie Moore. I'm from Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Thank you to UNA-NCA for partnering with us for this amazing event. Again, thank you to the speakers and Amanda for moderating. It was very enlightening, and I'm so thankful for everyone who was able to take time during the workday to come and join us. So Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, very similar to UNA-NCA. We're here headquartered in the DC area, but we are an international organization of young professionals interested in international relations. We put on events like these on a monthly basis. So we do lunch and learns. We also do happy hours. We just had a happy hour with young professionals at USAID. So please look at our website at ypfp.org to learn more. Our membership is $25 a year, and there's a free membership for students. So if you are still in school, it's a great opportunity to get involved and learn more about a career in foreign affairs. So thank you again, and I appreciate everyone for being involved today. And again, I'm going to pass it over to close us out. So here we go. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.